Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We collect paper-based items such as books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and more to help tell Indiana's unique stories. We then find ways to share these stories through publications, exhibits, and events such as this one. Through these documents, we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're going to learn about Muslims of the Heartland with our guest, Dr. Edward Curtis, who is the William M. and Gail M. Plater Chair of Liberal Arts and Professor of Religious Studies at IUPUI. Dr. Curtis, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
We are also being joined by our moderator, Nicole Martinez-LeGrand, who is our Multicultural Collections Curator. Thank you for joining us, Nicole.
Thank you.
So before I hand it over to Nicole, I just have a few pieces of logistics to go over. For our event, Nicole and Dr. Curtis will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have questions as we go along, please drop it in the question and answer section of your Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of our program. If you'd like to add anything to the chat box, don't forget to change your response to all panelists and attendees so that we can all see your thoughts. Keep an eye on the chat, where I will be dropping in links and URLs throughout the conversation. Don't worry if you miss one, they will be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded, and you can watch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the coming weeks. And if you enjoy the program, please consider coming back for more. Our next History Happy Hour is on February 10th, where we talk with Dr. Nancy Kism and John Hardin about Father Boniface Hardin and his legacy in Indiana. You can sign up for that event and more over at indianahistory.org. You can find out more information about this and other virtual programs we'll have coming throughout 2022. All right, take it away, Nicole.
All right, thank you all for joining us. So I'm just going to start off with a very basic question. So, Dr. Curtis, well, before we go into our Q&A, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Edward Curtis. Dr. Edward Curtis is the William M. and Gail Plater Chair of Liberal Arts and Professor of Religious Studies at the Indiana University School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. Curtis holds a doctorate in religious studies from the University of South Africa, a master's in history from Washington University, and a bachelor's of art in religion from Kenyon College. And he grew up in Southern Illinois, so he is from the Midwest. So a bit more about your wonderful work. So tell us a little bit about yourself beyond what I just did in our introduction, and what can you tell us about your present work?
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's my pleasure to be with you all. I appreciate the invitation to tell you about my latest book. You can see the map on which my book cover was based as my background. So today we can refer to that throughout the whole session. Like you said, I grew up in Southern Illinois for the most part, but I also spent a little bit of time in Evansville, Indiana. In fact, my first job ever, paid job, was being a gardener in New Harmony, Indiana, which is one of our great historical sites in this state. In 2005, I came to IUPUI after being offered my current position from UNC Chapel Hill, and I got the chance to live about 3.5 hours from my hometown. So I mentioned all of this background is really important to the book, because all of both sides, my mother and my father's family, are from Southern Illinois, have been from Southern Illinois for more than 100 years. And that includes my mother's family, who are all who come from Arabic-speaking immigrants from what today are Syria and Lebanon. And that is the very population that is the subject of this book. The main theorist that I look to understand the lives of these immigrants from Syria and what today are Syria and Lebanon, and at that time was just the Ottoman Empire, was the main theorist I looked to was my grandmother. Oftentimes, academics will cite fancy theorists with nice French names,
Mhm.
that are difficult to pronounce in English, like Baudrillard and Foucault, and but it was my granny who was an Arab American who really set down the ideas that I followed through in this book. And one of the things my granny raised me with, among the things, was the idea that Arabic speaking people in the Midwest were connected to one another.
Mhm.
I got the idea that there was a real regional identity of Syrian and Lebanese people from my grandmother, because she
Wonderful.
told me the stories of going to Terre Haute for the Maharajans, for the festivals. She met her husband, who was actually from Oklahoma, when she was at St. Mary's in South Bend. She had friends in Iowa, the Humpsies in Iowa, and lots of friends in St. Louis. And these Syrian and Lebanese people, they were incredibly committed to spending time with one another, and they love to have fun together.
Mhm.
It's so much fun together. And so it was really my and it's to her memory, Cassie Samaha Moses Safa Caffrey, to whom I dedicated the book. So I talk about, in the introduction to the book, it's a very personal introduction, because I talk about the entree, how my grandmother became the person that really inspired this book in a lot of ways.
Wonderful. So you mentioned, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. Can you tell us a little bit more about her experience or the Arab and well, let's before we go into the Arab and Muslim community, let's talk about the difference between the two, because I think that's what our audience needs to know first before we go deep. We do a deeper dive into this community.
Absolutely. Yes. It gets very confusing very quickly. And so that's a great question. So, all right. So there are about 1.8 billion Muslims around the globe. Most of them are not Arabs. Half of all Muslims live east of Karachi, Pakistan, which is not an Arab country.
Hmm.
So the majority of Muslims actually live in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And but it's a global religion like Christianity. So that's the first thing. So and then overall, most Arabs are Muslim, and Arabs live. There are actually more Arabs who live in North Africa than in what we call the Middle East. But Arabs have always been religiously diverse. They are Jewish, they are Christian, they are Druze, which is a different religion we probably won't have time to talk about.
Hmm.
And now they are Hindu and Buddhist and atheist and secularist. So Arabs are an ethnicity, like Latinx or Latino and Latinas. They're
Hmm.
not a religion, right? In America, the situation's different. There are about 2 to 4 million Arab Americans in the United States. The majority of them are actually Christian, not Muslim. And that's because of historical patterns of immigration from Syria and Lebanon, the very places we're talking about today. So they are a very diverse group, these Christians. They are Orthodox, they are Protestant, they are Catholic.
Okay. Can you tell us more about what that history looks like here in Indianapolis and Indiana? You mentioned a lot of great different cities from the north to the south.
Right. So perhaps 90% overall of the immigrants who came from the Ottoman Empire
Hmm.
in what today are Syria and Lebanon were Christian. The Midwest was a little different in that when you look at the Dakotas, and you can see behind me, you can probably see the Dakotas there with a tar paper
Hmm.
shack. By the way, it was minus 35 yesterday in Minot. And some of these people that I write about in the book, they lived right close to mine, and they were living in that 10 by 12 tar paper shack that you see on my screen there. And so they really roughed it, I mean, at the beginning
Hmm.
of their existence here. But so in some places in the Midwest, for example, in South Dakota and in North Dakota, 1/3 of all the Arabic speakers were Muslim, not Christian. And here in Indiana, our population in central Indiana these people who immigrated from the 1870s until World War I, they were almost all Christian in Terre Haute and in Indianapolis. But in northern Indiana, and you might see the John Barker caboose next to Michigan City, there were thousands of Syrian and Lebanese Muslims before World War I. And so up near Chicago, up near the Michigan border, you have a lot of, now you also had a lot of Christians as well. But if we look at the state as a whole, we have a very rich history of Arabic speaking people, including Christians and Muslims and some Druze before World War I.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more, in your book? I like that your book kind of gives this perspective of lives lived, right? The lives, of your grandmother. Can you tell us some stories, some snippets from the book that you feel like that really resonate with you, or you think audience members would connect with, or your readers would connect with?
Absolutely. So rather than give a general picture with a lot of statistics, the way that I write the book is I've written it for a popular audience, not for an academic audience. It's full of narrative, of stories. And I concentrate on characters, and both men and women. And so there are enormous, the book begins really with the story of Alia Ogdi Hassan from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who is born in Kadoka, on a homestead, and whose mother threatens to leave her father if she doesn't move into the big city of Sioux Falls. And so and we follow her throughout her life. We get to see what elementary school she did, what instruments she played, the poetry that she wrote as a teenager, her unsuccessful first marriage, her love of dancing, her incredible interest in Hinduism and yoga, all of these things. So she later becomes, you would have no idea from the period I cover, she later becomes one of the most important Muslim and Arab leaders in the United States. But during the 1920s and 1930s, there was, you wouldn't be able to guess that, given the hard times on which she fell. But that's the kind of story we tell. Do I have a favorite story? I think I love all of my characters in the book, and I feel attached to them. I have a soft spot for pacifism, for people who are anti-war, and I tell the story of one man from Western North Dakota who was very much opposed to both World War I and World War II on moral grounds. I like that contradicts the stereotypes associated with Muslims who are sometimes made out to be very violent people, but this man is a pacifist and a farmer. So I love that story. I love the story of Muhammad Dabaja, who is the very first person from Michigan City conscripted, not an Arab, the very first person of any ethnic background, conscripted into the American Expeditionary Forces, that is the U.S. Army, during World War I. And discovering his story and one that has not been written about, it was a lot of fun to be able to do that.
So you talked about them as characters, but are they real? Were they real living people? And how did you construct these narratives?
Right. So even though this is a popular history, it's all based on a fact. There's no speculation. If there is any speculation, I say it may have been, but it's all based on historical facts. So you can look at there are footnotes or endnotes so that you can see what the sources are. So the sources include, first of all, oral histories that were hidden in libraries like the Michigan City Library or the North Dakota State Historical Society. A number of them were at the Smithsonian and the Museum of American History. So I'm using oral histories, some in the History Center in Cedar Rapids. These fantastic, what's great is the public library at Michigan City, they recorded these people's stories. I mean, and that ended up being, I'm so grateful that local historians and local librarians, thought it was important enough to record these stories. So that's a major treasure trove for all of us in Indiana. It's a wonderful library up there in Michigan City.
And it's
Okay, so-
accessible.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we got those, and then I used Sanborn insurance maps to see what the buildings that they looked like, what they were made of, how big they were, what they were next to, who were their neighbors. Same thing with city directories, immigration records. When did they come? What ship did they come over on, or did they cross? Some of them crossed the border at Mexico or Canada. So, in Laredo or somewhere like that. So, where do they come from? World War I and World War II records, their military records, where did they serve? What was their service like? Local newspapers. Now, a lot of these newspapers, as a lot of your audience probably know, are digitized. So you can do keyword searches through databases like newspapers.com. But in Michigan City and in Western North Dakota, there are a number of newspapers that are not digitized. So in that case, I had to either, I had to try to convince the library from Dakota to send down the microfilm, or I went to the Indiana State Library and, just did the old fashioned thing where you sit in front of the screen and you just go, you look for needles in haystack, looking for, there's no other way to do it. That gives you a good sense, though, of what the whole community is talking about. So that's what I did in Michigan City.
We've got a good question from Tom. And so Tom asks, what motivated your characters to leave their home and emigrate to the US?
That's great. Do we have the map that we can show where they came from? This would be a good time to pull it up.
Yeah.
If we don't, no problem.
I'll bring up the map in just a second.
Okay, I'll talk while you're doing that. Thank you, John. So there were push and pull factors. The push factor was a terrible economy. The silk industry, which was a large part of the local economy in the Eastern Mediterranean, was collapsing. In addition, there was a lot of industrialization going on here in the United States, and many people were pulled by that's okay, John, if you can't get it, don't worry about it. Many people were pulled by the allure of free land in the West, and also because of the Homesteading Act. Okay, but also they were pulled by industrialists like John Barker of, there we go, there's the map of where many of these are the villages from which the people in my book came. And you can see that border between Lebanon and Syria at the time, that did not exist when they came. That was all one country. But then later that was drawn after they left by the French, who drew it after they defeated the Ottoman Empire in World War I. So there were push and pull factors: bad economy and at home, and the promise of economic opportunity here, which is the same story for tens of millions of people, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, who came to Indiana and all across the United States in what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age.
I know that in past conversations that you and I have had, you talked about the large community in Michigan City. Can you tell us what that community looked like?
Yes, absolutely. Can we see the next slide, and we'll look at a picture. Okay, so first of all, the first permanent mosque in the state of Indiana, as far as I can tell, was right here. This is it. Now, this may not look like what you generally associate with a mosque, but this is what most of the Midwestern mosques established by Muslims across the United States between World War I and World War II looked like. They blended in. If you can look at the little chimney in the entrance there, that's the minaret, which is an architectural feature that mosques have. So this was called the Asr al-Jadid, or the New Generation Islamic Arabic Society, and they took an existing house and they converted it in 1931. the place where they prayed was in the first floor there. And in the basement, then they would eat their allspice and cinnamon spiced lamb and rice dishes. They would sing Arabic songs. They would have, banquets. They would welcome both Arabs and non-Arabs to these banquets. This was just a few blocks from Lake Michigan, down on Third Street, and it's now in the 1960s it was taken away as part of urban redevelopment, and then they built an art center or something on top of it now. But this is part of our architectural and heritage in Indiana that we have through photographs, but not the physical thing. Probably the very first mosque. Interestingly, the majority of people in this mosque were Shia Muslims, not Sunni Muslims. But the Shia and the Sunnis, they prayed together. They couldn't afford to have separate mosques. They would gather together. Plus, they were linked by their common cultural heritage and the common language of Arabic. They came from the same villages oftentimes. So they had a lot, in common, in addition to having this sectarian difference between them of Sunni and Shia. So that's what their mosque looked like.
So did it relocate? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Did it relocate? What happened to the
Yes, they
mosque?
built a new one outside of town, which still exists today. Yep. And then if you go to the next slide, just one more. This is what the congregation looked like in the 1930s. And so, and the picture is taken, okay, this is why local history is so important. I did not know what this building was until I went to Michigan City and showed it. And then they said, well, of course, it's Kruger Memorial Hall in Kruger Park. Martin Kruger is the most famous leader of Michigan City in the early 1900s, a German Martin Kruger. And so, 1930s built. The other thing is we can date it because of the way we know that it was built during the New Deal. So we know this picture's 1930s, even though some of the fashions look a little 1920-ish, because we've got guys wearing Great Gatsby or newspaper boy hats. We've got women wearing flapper girl hats. And then we have some women in this picture wearing hijabs or headscarves as well. We got this beautiful mix of the first and second generations coming together and doing exactly what my granny used to tell me about. They love to have fun, eating and dancing and singing and reciting poetry together. And you see the Arabic at the bottom of the photo that says Ihtifal Jamiyat lil-Asr al-Jadid al-Islami, the gathering of the new generation Islamic society. That's how you translate the gathering or the party gathering. So this is what the congregation and look like, and we might have a third generation in there with the little kids, but you don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm. So, you are an established author, so this is not your first book, especially regarding Muslim American history. You wrote a 2-volume encyclopedia spanning over 500 years of Muslim American history, culture and contribution to the United States. Tell us about that. Who writes encyclopedias? Where did you find all of this information?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, the question. I was approached to write that, or to be the editor. The challenge of doing an encyclopedia is managing all the contributors. You edit everything as the editor, but you don't write everything. And and that tells the story of the role and the contributions of Muslims from the 1500s, before the United States was a country, 200 years before, in what would become the United States until today. It was a huge challenge, but I'm really proud of the final product, and it's still in use. I just was asked to do a new edition of it, so
good.
So it'll come out again this year. Just updated and added some articles. But so a lot of that encyclopedia is actually about Black history, because for long periods of time, people of African descent were the largest and most consequential population of Muslims in the United States. So in the 1800s, the largest group of Muslims were enslaved people from who had been captured from Africa. And then from between World War I and the 1960s, once many of your audience members will remember that in 1917 and 1924, Asian immigration was basically halted to the United States. And that bill wasn't really reformed until 1965 with the new Immigration and Naturalization Act. As a result, there were fewer Muslims coming and fewer Hindus and fewer Buddhists. And at that time, there were many, many more African Americans converting to and then raising their children as Muslims. So the Encyclopedia of Muslim American History, tells, because it's history, tells a lot of that story. And what my latest two books, I've got two books coming out this year. There's Muslims of the Heartland, and then in June, Arab Indianapolis will come out. And really focus much more narrowly on the Arabic speaking people and their heritage in the Midwest, and in particular here in Indianapolis.
Tom did ask another question. He says, we think of Shia versus Sunni Muslims as fighting each other, but it sounds like in the era of which you write, they were more like Baptists and Methodists, or Baptist versus Methodist. Is that the case?
Yes. Now, we're talking about a history that's more than 1,000 years old. So it's a history, just like in Christianity, a history of conflict and separation. It's not a black or white thing, but the idea that Sunni and Shia people, whether it is here or in Iraq or in Syria or Lebanon, that they cannot get along is false, because we have lots of evidence that there has been, but oftentimes it matters who's in power. And if the leader favors their own religious group over other groups, and then gives more power to that group, and then that creates an unfair and oppressive system. So it very much depends on that, and because that then creates tensions and violence among the different communities when there's inequality in the society.
So where in the state do you see significant growth of this community? Maybe just like, maybe you can split it up by region, or because I know it's not all monolithic, right? So
That's right. Well, so one of the interesting historical stories is when many of the new immigrants started coming in the 60s and 70s, they came to places like Indianapolis, eventually establishing what would become the largest single Muslim American association, called the Islamic Society of North America, which is still headquartered in Plainfield, Indiana. And one of the things is they did not have the institutional memory of all of these other mosques and communities that I talk about in my book. And as a result, so much of that history was lost until only the last 10 or so years. And I'm not the only one doing it. There are other historians who are recovering the story of these Muslims who sacrificed their time and their treasure and their talent in order to teach their children about Islam. And that was a way not of rejecting American identity, it was a way of embracing American identity. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the Midwest, there is nothing more Midwesterner, being a Midwesterner, than to establish your own ethnic religious congregation. Everywhere people go, they have their ethnic religious congregation. I mean, they have their Polish, their Irish, Roman Catholic, congregation. They've got their Ashkenazi or their Sephardi Jewish congregation. They've got their Scandinavian holiness congregation. Ethnicity and religion are very much tied in the Midwest. So when Syrian or Arabic speaking Muslims, arrive here, in many ways, their congregation becomes more important to their community life here than it ever was back in Syria and Lebanon. I mean, maybe the men went to go pray once a week at the mosque, you know, and the women went to shrines of saints more often, you know. But here, suddenly, in being American, that religious ethnic congregation becomes their community center. So there's this false idea sometimes that maintaining our traditions somehow becomes a rejection of assimilation. Actually, our traditions are what allow us to assimilate to America, because we gain the kind of power and the community power, and also the kind of community comfort and fun and love that we need in order to make it in America.
It's a very good point. So you mentioned Plainfield. So is there still a large community in the north part of the state? What about the southern part of the state?
Yeah, and I didn't completely answer your question, because I got excited about that.
No, it's a great
point
answer
about assimilation versus preservation of culture. So yeah, so what's happened is since 1965, we've seen so in the 1960s, the largest community of Muslims in the city of Indianapolis, and probably in the state, was the Nation of Islam, led by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, which is a different denomination, is neither Sunni nor Shia. It's a different denomination of Islam. But then after the Immigration Reform Bill in 1965, more and more people started coming from all over the world. They came from Latin America. And by the way, there is a Muslim population that Muslims actually moved from Latin America to here, not only in Spanish-speaking countries, but places like Suriname, where there's a large Muslim population. So they moved to the United States. And then they came from Africa, they came from Asia, and they came from Europe, because remember, there are, you know, Muslim majority countries like Bosnia in Europe. I mean, and Russia has a very large Muslim population. So Muslims came after 65 from all over the world. They came to the Hoosier state. They were, if they had an engineering, a medical, or some other essential skill, they were given favoritism by the system. And this is why we ended up, you know, fueling a lot of our local. If you notice, if you go to a hospital, if you go to Eli Lilly, you'll see a lot of Muslims from a lot of different backgrounds working there, right? So they've really changed the landscape and fueled the Indiana economy for the last half century. And so they've been growing. So we have now a very diverse. We have over, just looking at Indianapolis, we have over a dozen mosques, and really, in many ways, we have a microcosm of the Muslim world. A small part of that is Arab. In fact, it's so small that there's not one majority Arab mosque, probably. There might be a slight majority, but maybe it's probably more like a 30 or 40% of this or that mosque might be Arab. So, you know, it's very different than it was than the era I'm talking about. But we have enormous growth. There's also anywhere there's still a large community in northern Indiana. There's a community in Evansville. All over our state now, we have Muslim communities from different ethnic and national backgrounds. We have that in Indiana.
So one more question for me before we go into audience questions. What would you say are the most important issues facing Muslims in Indianapolis or Indiana today?
Yeah, so it depends. Almost all Muslims share the same challenge of Islamophobia, which has only gotten worse since it existed before 9/11, but it's gotten worse. And the prejudice, discrimination, and violence, both from citizens, but also from their own government, in immigration policy, in national security policy, the way that Muslims are often assumed to be guilty with no evidence whatsoever. So that's a challenge that all Muslims, regardless of their other identities, share. But it depends then, but for some people, their class might matter. For example, if you're poor, this might be a more pressing issue than that discrimination. If you're Black, anti-Black racism, it doesn't matter whether you're atheist, Muslim, or Christian. When the police pull you over and you're Black, then that might be, it. So we're talking about multiple issues. If you're GLBTQ, you face discrimination and challenge. So these are all the challenges, but there are also opportunities, because there have been several institutions that are trying very actively to embrace Muslim people. I mean, I'm very proud of my campus overall. When I talk to other colleagues and talk to people, you can't go from one end of the campus to another at IUPUI without hearing a non-English language being spoken and seeing a woman wearing a headscarf. It's a fairly safe space. Now, is it perfect? No, but we do have spaces and places where we are actively cultivating the Indiana, the heartland that we all want to live in. And we've got to, in addition to looking at our challenges, I think we absolutely have to find the good and praise it, as Alex Haley, the author of Roots, said.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think so. We're going to go to some of our audience questions. So somebody did ask in the Q&A, how many Muslims are in Muncie? They want to know about the community in Muncie.
So we don't know how many Muslims there are anywhere, because our US Census does not ask about religion. We only can come up with educated guesses. What we can say is we know how many people come from the Middle East, come from South Asia. We know how many people tell the census taker that they, if they were born here, that they have a South Asian background. But just because you're South Asia, that doesn't mean anything. You could be Hindu, you could be Muslim, you could be Christian, I mean, you could be Jain. I mean, so, so just, we can't, so it's very hard. The Pew Research Center has done its best to estimate the number of Muslims in the United States. We look at about 4 million or so, a little bit more than 1% of Americans. And what's most interesting about that is when you ask the common citizen, and we have polling data on this, what percentage of people, Americans, they think are Muslim, they always guess much higher. They think it's like 10% or more. I think because of the visibility of Muslims, especially after 9/11, you see one and you think there are a ton of them if you're not Muslim. And so actually, there are, for example, there are probably 5 to 6 million Jewish Americans. There are probably about 4 million Muslim Americans. But these are relatively small percentages of our population. So in Muncie, we're probably looking at thousands of people, but these are all just guesstimates.
Okay, another question that we have based on your wonderful slides that you showed. So prior to the French sectioning off Lebanon, what was the whole region known as Syria?
Yeah, Syria included what today we call Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. It was sometimes called in French the Levant, or the Levant, or the Holy Land, sometimes called Bilad Shem in Arabic, the land of Shem, and so that was or we just refer to it as the Eastern Mediterranean. Before World War I, oftentimes the town from which you came was more important to your identity than the empire to which you answered. And so, so people very much identified as whether they're Beiruti or Damascus or Hamsi or Qudsi, that is, they're from Beirut or Damascus or Homs or from Jerusalem. That's how they oftentimes would be a more sort of social identity that was more powerful.
Okay. We do have another question. What are most of the mosques the Nation of Islam in Indianapolis? So you talked about how that was, in terms of denomination. So that's what they want to know about the mosques of Indianapolis, denomination.
Yes. So of the dozen mosques in Indianapolis, there's one Nation of Islam temple. It's on 38th Street or around 38th Street.
Okay. And do we have any other questions? So this is your time to ask some really great questions with an expert here.
I see that there's one about whether there are published memoirs or autobiographies by Muslim people from the Midwest who lived before World War I. The answer is no. No, there is not. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, was that I really wanted to recover those voices and get them out. So you hear them speaking. I mean, you know where they go to school or where they work. You hear, you hear their voices, and they really come alive.
I'll ask a question. So you showed the great slide of places that no longer exist. What are some other places of note in your research throughout Indiana that are no longer there that we should be aware of, that are historically significant?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, so if we're just talking about Muslims in Michigan City, there are the coffee houses, for example, along Franklin Street, which is one of the main drags there. And I think that's what it's called, if I'm remembering correctly. Anybody from Michigan City, correct me. And so one of the things the book does is look at, sometimes they were out of the way. So we have to, when we go to Franklin Street now, with this knowledge, we have to imagine what they're smoking. They might be smoking a water pipe. They're drinking strong Turkish coffee, reading Arabic language newspapers to each other, talking about what's going on at the Barker factory. So this is one way of recreating, and then even though it was not Muslim, the Christian neighborhood that existed where Lucas Oil Stadium is today, that was the first Arabic speaking neighborhood of Indianapolis. And that's now gone. Obviously it's buried. But that was the home of where everybody, it was called the Syrian Quarter or the Syrian Colony in 1900. And that I explore that place and the people there a lot in my Arab Indianapolis project, including, in addition to the book coming out in June, we have a 1 hour long documentary that will appear on WFYI that the local Arab American community and I are making with the help of a lot of people, including a lot of help from IUPUI. I can't wait for it. But so we got the book, and we've got the movie, and then we have the blog arabindianapolis.com. So we're trying to piece together, because so much of the history here is, I talked about how some of the Muslim history was lost. Well, a lot of the non-Muslim and Muslim, well, I should say non-Muslim history of Arabs in Indianapolis has also been lost. And so, so we have to go through a recovery effort. And that's a fascinating story because, if you look, there are dozens of books about Arabic speaking people or Arabs in Detroit, dozens. And that's a story that people are familiar with. But before we started really uncovering these stories, you couldn't find practically anything. I mean, they're in the Peopling of Indiana book that I think IHS puts out or has done. There was a section, a few pages.
I do. I have the book right here.
But very little information compared to the. Hard to see because of the camera.
I know.
Right?
Yeah, it's Peopling Indiana, the ethnic experience.
I mean, very little information. So this is, and no scholarly articles or books, none. So this is really, so it's been deeply satisfying to work with people here in Indianapolis to try to recover these stories. I think both my book, Muslims of the Heartland, and the Arab Indianapolis book in a sense, they are contemporary. They have contemporary relevance because of the battle for Indiana and the Midwest past. There are sometimes people who assume that that the Midwest past and the Indiana past was lily white and all Christian. And that was exactly what the Ku Klux Klan wanted to convince everybody in the 1920s here in Indiana, that the heart, what it really meant to be American, was to be white and to be Protestant, not even Catholic, but Protestant. And what happened was, in a way, I mean, we really let the KKK win the battle for the past when we accept that lazy stereotype of the Midwest as a white Christian country, because we have never, ever been white and Christian. Now, I felt that as a boy growing up in Southern Illinois, that I thought that my brown skin was an intervention, a foreign intrusion into a white land. It turns out, though, that my own family's history and that of families of people across this region, that we've always been part, not just of the city, we've always been in agriculture and in rural, in the rural Midwest too. And that's, my book spends a lot of time talking about Muslim farmers in Iowa and the Dakotas as a way of recovering, you know, and of course, before Africans and Eurasians got here, Native American people were already religiously, linguistically, and culturally diverse in the Midwest. There were different nations who occupied the land that we call the Midwest. So we have never been a white Christian country. We've always been plural. And so these projects, both Muslims of the Heartland and Arab Indianapolis, are attempts to create a heartland that has a bigger heart, that loves all of its people and loves us abundantly.
Wonderful. We still have some time left, and we got some more questions that have, you know, some of your statements have really generated some great questions. So one of them is asking about schools that teach Arabic. So I know with other ethnic cultures, they have kind of like their many like cultural schools. So do those exist today where they are maintaining that culture outside of the mosque, or is it part of the mosque experience? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, and of course, we still have Arabic speaking Christians as well. So there are a couple mosques in which Arabic instruction, there are a few mosques in which Arabic instruction is offered. And this is to both non-Arabs and Arabs can take the Arabic. And just as a reminder, the majority of Muslims in Indiana and in the United States are not Arab, right? Arabs are about a quarter of all the Muslims in the United States. So, so give or take, according to the Pew Research Center data. And so there are, but unless you are growing up in, you either are really good at language or you're growing up in a true Arabic speaking home where your parents are speaking. Oftentimes, in order to preserve the language, the kids get sent to the Middle East or to North Africa to visit their relatives in the summers, or they have to study. In my family, for example, Arabic, my mother doesn't speak a word of Arabic except a couple cuss words and tabbouleh and hummus. Tabbouleh hummus, and that's it. And so I started studying Arabic when I was 19 and studied for years and lived in the Middle East. And so, you know, and there are people of my generation who do that, you know, third and fourth generation who pick the language back up. But it's in places like Detroit, where you have larger Arabic speaking communities and more Arab media, the free and voluminous nature of Arabic media means that people who develop literacy either as a child or later can then keep it up even if there's not a big community. So that's sort of the landscape very quickly of Arabic language. And this is as true for Christians as it is for Muslims, because remember there are, you know, a lot of Syrian Lebanese Christians as well, and Egyptian Christians and Iraqi Christians including people in our own community.
Mhm. One last question. So you had mentioned the Ku Klux Klan and their legacy here in Indiana. And so Tom asks, we know that the Klan was anti-Jew and anti-Catholic, but did they actively focus on Muslims as well?
Not the second iteration, but the fourth iteration does. I mean, I see a lot of, it depends on how strict you are in terms of how you define the Klan. But I think we're really going through a fourth iteration of Klanism here and of course, the one that was big in Indiana was the second iteration. And you have a lot of resources at IHS for people to learn about that. But yes, the fourth iteration of the Klan and Klan-like groups are absolutely centered on anti-Muslim prejudice. The 1920s iteration of the Klan was not.
Okay. So is there any, lasting statements or something you really want the audience to really understand about, Muslims of the Midwest before we end this program? What do you really want them to the big takeaway?
Well, I think I shared my biggest and most personal takeaway, that this history is part of recreating who we were so that we can see ourselves today differently. That Arabs are not new to this place, that we have helped to build it just as much as most other Hoosiers, because most other Hoosiers also trace their roots to the time after the Civil War and before World War I when they came, with immigration, right? Huge numbers of people coming to the Hoosier state at that time. So I think that is my biggest takeaway. I would say too, that the other one, I would just reiterate the idea that Muslims and other minorities, whether they're religious minorities or racial minorities or ethnic minorities, aren't always torn between the old country and the new world. It's possible to love both places, to be a proud American, to be a proud Arab, to be a proud Syrian. It is indeed this generation that settled in Indiana before World War I and raised their kids and established a mosque and fought for the United States in World War I and World War II. They believed deeply that you could be all of those things. And their example sort of calls to us as the possibility that we can be more than one thing. And that we can accept that difference is just part of who we are as Hoosiers.
Great. I know that in the chat we had listed some links regarding to both books, Arab Indianapolis through Belt Publishing and Muslims of the Midwest, which I just got my email notification that my book is on the way through NYU Press. And as a follow-up for attending this program, you will get an email with those links so you can order those directly. And another helpful links that we had mentioned in the chat during this wonderful presentation. So everybody, Kimberly says, fascinating. I look forward to reading your book. And
thank you so much for having me. It's always good to, and I appreciate the work you're doing.
Well, we thank you. So Tom and Mark and everybody else, there's everybody else here on this chat are very excited about this. So it was an honor to have you as our guest and to learn more about you and your research and the culture and contributions of the Muslim community of the Midwest. So that concludes our program, and look for that update email with all that information coming to you soon.
And yeah, and I would just like to add that thank you again for joining us. I thought this was one of just a really amazing conversation. I know that I learned so much. If you enjoyed this program, please check out our next History Happy Hour, which will be on February 10th. We will talk with Dr. Nancy Kism and John Hardin about the life and experiences of Father Boniface Hardin, who fought for equality and was one of the founders of Martin University. And we've also got some other great events coming up at the Indiana Historical Society. If you'd like to learn more about these events, please check us out over at www.indianahistory.org. And we will be posting this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel and our website in the upcoming weeks. And thank you all for showing up, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Have a great evening. Thank you.